Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico here at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. It is our pleasure to welcome you to our hallways. For 3 years now, we have witnessed a constant back and forth on the issue of trade in North America. From the beginning of his political campaign, the president has questioned the goodness and virtues of the North American Free Trade Agreement. One of his first acts of government, in fact, was to call for a renegotiation of NAFTA. Over the following months and years after that, the agreement has been rewritten, revamped, and updated into what is now known as the United States Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, or USMCA. Yet, this close to a complicated political period in our country, the USMCA is yet to be approved on Capitol Hill. Now, many of us are convinced that regardless of how we get there, it is important to resolve once and for all the issue of trade in North America and to finally put in place the commercial framework that will prevail over the next decade or two. Only this will give greater certainty to investors and consumers throughout North America, from the Yukon to the Yucatan. Beyond the certainty required in our business environment, to be able to plan for the long term, we know that NAFTA, despite all its defects and negative externalities, has created unprecedented benefits for all companies and citizens throughout our continent. It has also propelled cooperation on many other issues by setting the basic ground for mutual trust among our nations. Indeed, regardless of where we are ideologically, we recognize that much of our future depends on the legal, legitimate, and freer movement of capital, goods, services, and yes, people in our continent. And we also know that this agenda has allies on both sides of the aisle. So, to speak on this important issue still pending on Washington, D.C.'s docket, and what we can expect over the next weeks and months, we welcome Congressman Kevin Brady. To welcome Representative Brady, please let me call one of our own, the Baker Institute Will Clayton Fellow on International Trade and Economics, David Gantz. David, in addition to being the Will Clayton Fellow in Trade and International Economics here at the Baker Institute, is the Samuel M. Feckley Professor of Law at the University of Arizona's James E. Rogers School of Law and Director Emeritus of the International Trade and Business Law Center. David has an extensive curriculum on issues of trade and international law, and we are very pleased to have him here to introduce Congressman Brady and to lead our discussion today. David.
Tony, thank you very much for that introduction. It is a great pleasure for me to be here in Houston at the same time as Chairman Brady and to formally introduce him, even though I suspect for most of you, you are already very familiar with his background. He has represented the 8th District in Texas now for 22 years. And for those of us who have been engaged in trying to bring about freer trade for many, many years, he is really one of the ideal members of Congress. He was a key factor in getting the U.S. Dominican Republic Central American Free Trade Agreement through the Congress. Ditto for the Panama Agreement, the agreements with South Korea and with Colombia. As you can see from this background, he has worked extensively with both Democrats and Republicans, Democratic and Republican presidents, to further the trade interests of Texas and of the United States. Certainly he was key in an area which was very, very important for Texas in getting rid of the limitations on U.S. exports of oil, something which has helped to revolutionize the oil industry in the United States over the last few years. So I am particularly happy to be able to be here and to help facilitate this process. What we're going to do here is give the chairman, former chairman, I suppose I should say, maybe future chairman as well, of the House Ways and Means Committee, and before that of the Trade Subcommittee. But it gives the chairman an opportunity to make an introductory statement. Then we'll go through a few points, both procedurally. I suspect most of you are aware of much of the substance of the USMCA, but you and I and many, many others are interested in, of course, in the question, can we get this through Congress this year? And we'll talk a little bit about that, and soon, very quickly, we'll open it up to questions from the floor. I think it makes sense to focus on USMCA as long as there are questions there, but again, you have before you one of the nation's leading trade experts, so a font of information, and hopefully tell us what's going on in some of the other areas as well, if time permits. Anyway, with no further delays, I'm very pleased to introduce Chairman Brady.
Dr. Gantz, thank you so much for the introduction and I recognize you'll be grilling me here in a few minutes, but I want to thank you in advance for your policy research and the insights, the tools you give us as policymakers, incredibly important. To Director Payon for kicking off this conversation and your work at the Center for the United States and Mexico. Ambassador Dridgen, it is great to see you again. Your long-standing, brilliant leadership of the Baker Institute is one of the many blessings that Houston and policymakers throughout the world are grateful for, including me. To President Leibran, thank you for your relentlessly visionary leadership of Rice. We had a few moments to visit with earlier this morning. Continues to amaze and impress me, just your vision for what this university can be and the young minds that you're shaping. Thank you for what you bring to our region and to our country as well. And to an old friend, Nathan Cook, thank you for making the arrangements to bring me here today. You know, I credit my involvement in Dr. Gantz in free trade in large part to the namesake of the institution, James A. Baker. Shortly after being elected to Congress, I sought out the advice of President George H.W. Bush here in Houston and Secretary Baker on which economic issues to focus in Washington. I was the Chamber of Commerce executive my entire adult life. My focus, my experiences was in helping start new businesses, in recruiting industry, in creating a pro-growth business climate in whatever region I served. And I wanted to know from them how best to further that job creation at the national level. Secretary Baker advised me to focus on international trade. We had a long discussion about this, and ultimately he introduced me to Bob Zoellick, who would later become the U.S. Trade Representative under President George W. Bush. And because the complexity of trade, economic, political, historical complexities, I sought an opportunity to learn a trade agreement and engage from soup to nuts, from the announcement through the negotiating rounds, passage to Congress, entry into force, and ultimately implementation. I believe the best way I could lead on trade was to understand it from the beginning to the end. And so it was in the White House dining room that Ambassador Zoellick invited me to play that role in Congress for what he described then as a strategic but non-controversial trade agreement that he was proposing for Central America. I jumped at the opportunity, a little knowing it would consume years of my congressional life and become one of the most politically difficult agreements to pass since NAFTA itself. But the trade hook was set. And so ultimately, on the Ways and Means Committee, I've been fortunate to engage in passing 12 of the 14 free trade agreements we have in place today as a country, congressional approval of both China and Russia's ascension into the World Trade Organization, and through 2 updates of the trade rules that determine how White House and Congress develop and consider future trade agreements. I believe in the freedom to trade. It is the greatest economic freedom we possess, and it lies at the heart of our free enterprise system. Thank you. It is crucial for the American people to understand that the term free trade, like free speech, doesn't refer to its cost, but to the freedom to trade. It is about preserving and expanding our individual and collective freedom as Americans to buy and sell and compete anywhere in the world with as little government interference as possible. To the entrepreneur, toiling deep into the night working on their new breakthrough idea, this freedom ensures you have the opportunity to place that product or service on the market and make it available throughout the globe. For American consumers, for families, for that single mom, the freedom to trade protects your ability to choose from the broadest range of products at a price that works for you. And one of the key reasons I love the freedom to trade is because it poses a crucial question. Who has the power? Who has the power to decide what products you can buy at what price? Is it Washington, special interests, labor unions, or is it you, the consumer? Free trade ensures that it is the consumer, ultimately you, that has the power to decide what to buy and at what price. I'm also convinced that we live in a world that increasingly chafes at the establishment. Well, the freedom to trade is the most anti-establishment power Americans enjoy today. It guarantees that when a new product is designed, a better service unveiled, a new breakthrough technology produced, that special interests can't hold you back from selling it, from buying it, or even disrupting an entire industry if you've delivered a product or service that is better than what exists today. So as Thomas Jefferson wrote, commerce with other nations is not only necessary and beneficial to all parties, it is a right and a duty. The freedom to trade is a right in America, and we ought to keep that in the forefront as we work through the trade debates of our time. America and Texas especially, we're made for trade. But it's even greater than that. The freedom to trade can lift individuals, communities, whole nations, and the world out of poverty. Where freedom to trade flourishes, poverty reduces. Over the past few decades, more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty on this planet, due in large part to trade. Trade as a share of the world economy has nearly doubled to over 70%, and research confirms over and over again where the freedom to trade takes root, higher incomes, more affordable products, economic growth, human rights, and environmental protections follow. And that's why our subject today, the new USMCA Agreement, is so vital. So looking back in October 1992, when President George H.W. Bush joined leaders from Mexico and Canada to initial the original Nafta Agreement in San Antonio, he described the agreement as a turning point in the history of our three countries. He said, "We're creating the largest, richest, and most productive market in the entire world, a $6 trillion market of 360 million people that stretches 5,000 miles. This agreement," he said, "is an achievement of three strong and proud nations and expresses our confidence in economic freedom and personal freedom, in our people's energy and their enterprise." Over the next quarter of a century, NAFTA achieved many of its ambitious goals: quadrupling trade between the three nations, greater choices of affordable products, sales of more made-in-America goods and services, more affordable energy to fuel growth in all three countries, and integrated supply chains that allow our farmers, workers, and our businesses in all three countries to compete more successfully here and abroad. NAFTA also strengthened Mexico's democracy and human rights by helping make it a more stable and helping it move toward a more prosperous country. And key infrastructure investments along the border improve the environment between the U.S. and Mexico. But the world, as we know, isn't standing still. Today, there are over 280 trade agreements in place across the globe. Economies, technologies, and consumer demands continue to evolve. It was past time for NAFTA to be modernized, and that is precisely what the Trump administration achieved in partnership with Mexico and Canada. The new USMCA, as it's called, retains many of the successful foundations of NAFTA, including zero tariffs on all U.S. goods exported to Mexico and nearly all the products to Canada, including new openings for dairy, wine, and U.S. poultry. But those are good moves. But it goes beyond simply maintaining what was working. It moves to more than that, locking in key Mexican reforms in energy and telecommunications, creating a level playing field for financial services and investment, establishing the best digital trade rules of any trade agreement in existence in the world today, which will maintain America's leadership and innovation on this planet. It includes strong protections for intellectual property, including tools to guard against counterfeiting and piracy, and requires, for the first time, modern science-based food safety standards for agriculture and biotech. What we know is that modern 21st century trade agreements look different than older ones. They recognize that many trade barriers exist beyond the borders. And so in USMCA, the 3 North American countries are voluntarily removing discriminatory regulations and technical barriers to trade while modernizing custom procedures to move legal trade across borders faster, cheaper, and more secure for all 3 countries. This is important because trade barriers around the world often aren't at the border, quotas, subsidies, tariffs, but inside. And often countries design their system to be like trying to plug a U.S. A plug into a European socket. They're designed not to mesh. New trade agreements do the opposite, as USMCA does, creating the regulatory environment to plug in and move not just products but services. USMCA spurs U.S. innovation by shortening the time that American vendors need to wait for patents, and this preserves valuable time and dollars getting new products to the market, and it prevents foreign countries like China from getting a leg up. New rules will ensure central government, state-owned enterprises don't distort competition with private businesses, and that broader competition is enhanced, for example, by ensuring that antitrust investigations are fair, transparent, and based on sound economic analysis. Here, I think, is a key. This next part is a key to the success of this new agreement. To their credit, President Trump and his U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer sought from the very beginning to build Democrat support for this agreement, to buttress traditionally strong Republican support for trade in Congress. All of us, as free trade supporters, have believed bipartisan support for trade is crucial in the short and the long term for the country. For that reason, the President included the strongest and most enforceable labor provisions of any American trade agreement in history. USMCA requires Mexico to create a true union system, including collective bargaining rights, secret and personal voting, the right to strike, and tools to prevent Mexican union workers prevent violence against them. For labor Democrats, this is a dream agreement that embraces longstanding provisions they had never hoped to achieve or have never achieved to date under any administration. As a result, this agreement has drawn support from 3 former Obama cabinet officials and the former chair of the Democrat National Committee. Mexico has already passed a historic new law to implement these requirements. It is nothing short of transformational. Texas Congressman Henry Cuellar and I visited Mexico officials in August to assess their progress. In meeting with the Foreign Secretary, the Labor Secretary, and leading trade officials, it was clear to me and to Henry that Mexico is truly committed to these historic labor reforms. And the most interesting discussion I had was with Foreign Secretary Brar, who made the case pretty passionately that Mexico is seeking an economic future built on growth, on competitiveness and productivity, rather than low wages. They are seeing a future based on competitiveness and productivity, not low wages. That was the goal of the original NAFTA that has yet to be realized. This is significant because American workers have long complained that they've been forced to compete against artificially low wages in Mexico. In addition, USMCA will generate over $34 billion in new auto manufacturing investment in America and create 76,000 American auto sector jobs over the next 5 years. By requiring greater U.S. and North America content in our vehicles and higher average wages for U.S. or Mexican workers developing these vehicles for those imported in the U.S. Yes, this too has long been a long-standing concern for our Democrat colleagues. America should embrace and support these remarkable changes by passing this agreement as soon as possible. Every day, USMCA is stalled in Congress. American workers, our families, our economy are missing out. This new agreement is estimated to add over 176,000 new jobs to help fuel our nation's economy. President Trump has been right in insisting we have to level the global playing field for American companies. He is serious about implementing policies that will build on the growing successes we've seen from our tax and regulatory reforms by opening up new markets for us to sell more American products. Here at home, for Texas, no state stands to gain more when this agreement is approved, and no state stands to lose more if it fails. The Lone Star State exports over $137 billion to Mexico and Canada each year, which support over 900,000 of our Texas workers. Ag exports to our closest neighbors account for nearly $4 billion a year, supporting 23,000 ag jobs here in the state. U.S. crude exports have surged since the export ban was lifted 4 years ago. Most people don't realize my first task as Ways and Means Chairman wasn't tax reform. It was to negotiate with President Obama and Democrats and Republicans in Congress to end the 40-year ban on crude oil. We knew at the time the potential was huge, but it has been transformational, and we'll be getting more over the years. So we are exporting petroleum, coal, oil, natural gas products to our NAFTA partners, and we're just getting going. We're just getting going. So given the importance to Texas of growing trade with Mexico and Canada, and to build even stronger economic bridges with our closest neighbors, there's no sound reason for any of our state's 38 representatives in the House or the Senate to oppose the USMCA. In fact, every one of us ought to be its strongest advocates. Mexico has approved the agreement. Canada's ready and prepared to ratify. It's time for America to act. The U.S. will be losing out on more jobs, more customers, and a stronger economy unless the House takes up and Congress approves this agreement this fall. The President is eager to send USMCA to Congress and is only awaiting a green light from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. I believe there is growing bipartisan support for the agreement, and Speaker Pelosi, to her credit, established working groups among Democrats in the House to work with Ambassador Lighthizer to fine-tune the agreement to address remaining Democrat priorities. So in closing, I will say today, due to pro-growth tax reform and balanced regulation, America has recaptured the #1 ranking as most competitive economy in the world. To reach our full economic potential, we need more customers, the kind of customers that freedom to trade and USMCA can provide. As President Trump stated when the agreement was announced, this will bring all three great nations together in competition with the rest of the world. In the end, USMCA will not be a Republican win, will not be a Democrat win. It will be a win for the American people in a stronger, more beneficial alliance with our North American trading partners. It's exactly what we need. With that, thank you very much. I lost my microphone walking to the podium. So
we hope it works. I think it's pretty hard to ask any specific questions at this point about substance, but we'll give the audience a chance to do that in a minute. What I would like to do is to spend a few minutes talking about the process. And some of that is really nitty-gritty stuff. I guess my first question is, supposedly the administration and the working group will be able to discuss a specific proposal soon in the next week or so. Can you comment on that?
Yes, so when Speaker Pelosi listened to her conference, they identified 4 areas: labor, enforcement, environment, and prescription drugs, biologics. And so she ultimately appointed 4 working groups to work with Ambassador Lighthizer. They've been meeting for a number of months. Much of it discussed concerns and have that feedback, but toward the end here, specific proposals. That was presented to the ambassador early August. And throughout the month, he's continued the engagement. We expect him, or at least I would anticipate he brings a proposal back to the Speaker, Chairman Richie Neal, Ways and Means Committee, that can incorporate as much of those changes that and fine-tuning that are requested. I think he'll be very straightforward about what can't be done. The agreement won't be reopened, But as you know, it's pretty traditional for us to fine-tune it through the process, both as it's sent to Congress, the implementing legislation, the entry into force. All of that gives us opportunities to incorporate their priorities.
I think that your optimism is justified. Let's talk about numbers. There are 197 members of the House that are on the Republican side, 235 on the Democratic side. We need 218 votes to pass in the House, although hopefully it won't be quite that close. How many of the 197 Republicans can you count on to support the agreement?
The short answer is a lot. That support's been building. Steve Scalise, our Republican whip, and I launched our effort on USMCA about 4 months ago, just been steadily building support. As you know, trade agreements can become regional in nature as well. So not unusual to have to work through some of those issues. And then we also reached out to our Democrat colleagues about building that support as well. And so, yeah, it is, I think the goal the president has of recreating bipartisan support for trade, there's an opportunity here we haven't seen in a long time.
I think that's an interesting point. And going back to a couple of things you said about the Democrats on the other side. Traditionally, you've never gotten a Democratic majority in the House for a trade agreement. It's as far back as I can remember. In 2015, when Trade Promotion Authority was passed, even President Obama could only get, 33 votes. But things are different now, right? You mentioned labor. You mentioned environment. You mentioned the auto industry, and in addition to that, you've got 35 or 40 relatively new members of Congress who were elected a year and a half ago from purple or red districts who probably don't want to run against President Trump if they can avoid it. So does that help us?
It does help. I think the policy of the agreement itself is a bit stunning for those who've, on the Democrat side, who've always pushed for these, and they never even came close before. This is full on addressing those concerns. And I think part of the challenge for them has been, how do we fine tune it further? Because their request, which is these labor provisions are transformational. Are they real? Is Mexico going to commit? Are we going to commit to it? Very fair question. So a lot of the work, I think at the end of the day, Chairman Neal probably said it best. When it comes to our priorities on this agreement, our 3 priorities are enforcement, enforcement, and enforcement. I think that's going to help drive those numbers up. A majority would be a lot to ask for from Democrats, and there are those who, frankly, will not vote for an agreement that President Trump has proposed. But I think there is the opportunity here to dramatically balance this out, which I think is very positive for the future.
I think many share your optimism or realism in this case. Okay, let's talk a little bit about timing. It's now the 5th of September. You're back in session on the 9th, on Monday. Presumably, if Mr. Lighthizer and the committees can get things together in the next couple of weeks, there's plenty of time to move forward, let's say before Thanksgiving. If it doesn't happen before Thanksgiving, do you think there's any chance of getting it through this year or next year?
The answer is yes. I think we can get it through this year. You know, my hope too would be that time frame you described, but I'm not worried in the sense we get a lot done in December, good or bad, in Congress, and so there is that opportunity. Look, there's no timetable for this, but procedurally it's ready to go. The president has been very clear. He wants the speaker to be supportive. We'll send it up then. We need some time for the process to work and to move to the Senate. So this fall is very much a realistic timetable. I don't think anyone, including Speaker Pelosi, believes this should go into the next year, really believes that this is the key time.
I mean, you don't see any real concerns in the Senate, do you? You only need 51
No, I think
votes.
there'll be strong support. In many of the provisions that those working group issues in the House are mirrored in the Senate.
Okay. I think we should open this up now to questions. Basically, you can pick the people whose hands are up, and I'll leave it to you.
Doctor, I don't want you to lose any votes, so feel free to make those choices yourself.
All right.
I've learned this.
Questions?
Yes, sir. Dave Smith from the Woodlands, one of your voters. So we'll test you.
Good to see you, sir. Oh, gosh. I'm in trouble.
I spent a life in manufacturing, so, you know, today, Mexican labor rates are lower than China, and we have all this contention between U.S.-Chinese trade. Do you see American companies or just companies in general, instead of moving to Southeast Asia, move to Mexico instead?
Yes, so the answer is yes, and it's bigger. This agreement will help, I believe. But one of the big trends in globalization is supply chains are becoming regional. They're shorter. They're more nimble. You can move quickly to the environment and meet sort of the distribution, approach we use now to reach consumers. And so I think you already are starting to see that and have for the past 4 or 5 years. I think it gets accelerated. I also think, look, it won't change wage rates in Mexico overnight. It starts in the auto industry, but clearly with their commitment and this agreement in creating real unions there, ultimately are going to end up driving that type of wage and hopefully a type of investment that will strengthen their economy, which also has a lot of benefits for the U.S. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Sir.
Yes. Well, we will have a trade agreement hopefully with Mexico.
Just a little bit louder so the people in the back can hear you too.
Yes, well, we will have a trade agreement with Mexico. How do the policies of the new government in Mexico basically influence this trade as we see a very different government taking shape?
It's a great question. So when this was, after the election in Mexico, this in reality became a 4-party negotiation because the U.S. was also negotiating with the incoming administration in Mexico. So a lot of those discussions as this was finalized was with them at the table. And some changes occurred because of that. So I see strong commitment to this agreement with the new Obrador administration. They clearly see issues like energy different than the prior administration, but this agreement locks in those 2013 reforms, continues that access, and more recently, their administration reached an agreement with Sempra's Energy's pipeline, their Mexico partner, that indicates, or at least sends a signal, that that type of long-term investment even in a sensitive subject in Mexico is welcome. So I think we're all waiting to see how that plays out over time. But yeah, there will be differences. They were at the table during the agreement, and I think that augurs pretty well for implementing it. You bet.
Sir.
I'm George Baker. I publish a newsletter on Mexican energy. I have 2 questions. One is, what happened to the arbitration panels that deals with virtual expropriation that was so much discussed some time ago? And the second question is, you mentioned Texas being the most to gain and the most to lose. Texas and Louisiana would have the most to lose from another Macondo accident that could take place in Mexico. So I wonder if your team has thought about having an offshore safety annex to the agreement.
So that's the first I've heard of it, of that idea. Secondly, if you had to choose an energy industry from any country to drill responsibly, to continue work to lower emissions and deliver affordable energy, you would choose the U.S. industry to do it, which is why, again, as Mexico opens up that market, to me, they appear to be doing it responsibly and gradually, which is a good thing. And on your first point was what?
About the arbitration.
Oh, yeah. So look,
Expropriation.
yeah, so no agreement trade agreement is perfect. In reaching out to address Democratic concerns, the administration made some changes. Some of those in areas that that I see a different vision on. One of these is, how do you tackle U.S. So we want to chase customers in other countries, right? That's where we want to go. Some of it you can do from here, and others you need to make investments, whether it's energy or insurance, or you want a hotel stays, you got to be in Mexico. So, and we've longstanding had a provision that protects U.S. investors when they make that investment from being expropriated, or countries are smart, they use regulation to, in effect, hometown, and give advantage to their businesses. In this agreement, that provision has changed. No longer will those protections be available in Canada. In Mexico, they're limited principally to 5 different sectors. Energy, telecom, infrastructure are examples of it, and limited protections for the others, and really focused on physical taking of a facility. We think countries tend to be more sophisticated than that. That's an area, frankly, I'd rather have strengthened. In a separate part of that, Chapter 20, is what happens when you have a country disputing a country. We want to make sure that when those disputes arise, there is a panel to actually hear them. And that's an area where Democrats and Republicans actually are both pushing for some fine-tuning. That was a long answer to a short question, but it's a critical element of any trade agreement. How do you make sure that everyone lives by the contract?
So you're not satisfied with how it is, do I hear you rightly?
No, there are provisions that I love and others that I would have done differently, but that's the case in every, I've not yet seen a perfect trade agreement. And that was part of the effort to draw bipartisan support.
Just to add one point. In the area you're most interested in, which is hydrocarbons and maybe electric power, the changes from NAFTA and the other agreements are not that significant. They're mostly significant in a bunch of other sectors where you have exhaustion of local remedies, you don't have indirect expropriation being protected, and there are a few others as well. But I think the administration did a pretty good job in terms of balancing things by saying, for hydrocarbons, we don't dare reduce the protection.
One of the interesting substantive nuggets of NAFTA is that it does provide for labor mobility through the TN visas. And it took a very long time for this to be discovered and the number of TN visas to grow and to get to the point at which they're being requested now. Does the new agreement improve on that? Does it actually provide a framework for labor mobility, for people to be able to tap into different labor markets across the region, or is it fairly flat, or does it even go back?
So the answer is not really, and the reason is, as Congress lays out the negotiating objectives for presidents. And in our more recent trade promotion authorities, we have prevented the White House from negotiating immigration, visa, other changes in that area in our trade agreement. So this new agreement honors Congress's wishes that that be separate from the trade agreements themselves. We found that it created both support and opposition to those agreements. And at the end of the day, we prevent that from being part of the discussion.
Still in there. TN visas are still in there.
Yes, as it is.
It's been modified. I don't, in fairness, I don't know the details.
Can I check on that, Tony?
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Bruce Aitken. David, it's nice to see you again after all these years. Congressman, I'm a constituent and a former dispute resolution panelist on several trade agreements, so I really support what you've been doing. My question has to do with the politics of this. You've been pretty candid about your optimism, but also the difficulty of getting the 218, and particularly on the Democratic side. What industry groups could be doing more to support Congress? And we know who's against it and those who are strongly for it, but in the farm community, the high-tech community, are you getting the support you need, and if not, why? And what can we do?
So the answer is there are a number of sectors involved that have been involved in the coalition for the last number of months, and it's just as you would imagine, those who benefit: energy, agriculture, telecom, technology, manufacturing, services. Look, the U.S. is really good at exporting services. It's growing 60% faster than cargo. So don't think cargo, think accounting. Don't think computers, think energy management or insurance. We're very good at this, and this provides even more market opening in those areas as well. All of them have been engaged. My belief is that you can't win trade arguments in Washington, that is won here at home, that lawmakers need to be able to look down the street and say, or down the road and say, that farm will be selling 40% more or 20% more, or their prices are better. That manufacturing company is important. Those workers in my district, that's where I think more work has to be done to really translate this new agreement that's just as much about quality as quantity, as volume, about those benefits here at home in the Houston region and in Texas. And that's where I think more work needs to be done. What do you think?
Well, I think that there's a lot of industry groups that tend to be divided. And I think that they focus on particular issues. I do agree with you in terms of making it local. I'm all about that. I've written a law journal article on FTAs with a Milwaukee lawyer who's a young Obama type. He grew up in Ghana. And he's been very active with Trade North and groups in Wisconsin. And I think that to the extent that you work the states in these elections, the state legislatures for me are as important as the Senate, and getting out that one of the priorities of folks in Texas who would like to see you reelected and other people that we support, we care about this. It's not something most people think about every day. And I think that what you're saying makes sense to me. If industry groups that you've cited are doing a great job, like the cargo people, that's fine, that's great. They probably don't need to hear from us. But I do think local chambers of commerce, the city councils, the mayoral races, these issues never come up for them, and they ought to.
Yeah, it needs to be. And I think, too, that a good example of politics versus its benefit. So I think many of the Democrat presidential candidates are hammering hard on this from above, but you're seeing very strong support come from the local economy upward. And I think our challenge will be to make sure that, given a choice between the politics nationally and growth here at home wins.
Hi. Quick question. Without disclosing confidences or affecting any issues in terms of text, I was curious, what sorts of environmental issues is the working group focused on that might result in some fine-tuning?
Yeah, and so I think given a choice between the existing NAFTA on environmental issues and USMCA, 100 out of 100 Democrats would choose USMCA, because for the first time, those environmental obligations can be taken to dispute. They're just as enforceable as every other part of that agreement, something different from NAFTA. They went into more details about what those environmental agreements are, but still left in place are Republican negotiating objectives, which is no country should be compelled to join environmental agreements or make certain commitments. They should simply enforce the ones they've voluntarily joined. That has stayed in USMCA. That's crucial for conservatives like me. But the enforceability of it draws this up, makes it substantially more beneficial. Final point, I think there is a room here to fine-tune in this area. You know, we had a North American Development Bank. That's the right phrase, I think. Bottom line is, in the original NAFTA, President Bush wanted to make sure environmental issues along the border, water, sewer, and others, air, were addressed in trade. That's fair. It was that entity was successful in achieving a number of them. There's now interest among Democrats about sort of extending that more and addressing those environmental issues. That would seem fair to both Republicans and Democrats. That might be a common ground that we could create, the ambassador might create in this. So I don't want to tell you what he's going to do, but I think that's an area of interest to both parties.
Ma'am.
Carla Barato, nice to meet you, sir.
Good to see you.
Ask you, what will happen to the North American region if this agreement doesn't come into force? Are we going back to NAFTA?
So under existing, great question. So today, if it were to fail, existing NAFTA would remain in place. The President has made very clear that's unacceptable to him. And should it fail or stall out, I think he's been pretty clear that he will start the withdrawal process from NAFTA. No one wants to see that happen, and there's no need for it to. This is agreement, as I've said, that captures the strengths of NAFTA, builds upon that, and then reaches out in a bipartisan way that I've never seen in an agreement. There's absolutely no reason, none, for this to fail.
Questions? One
one final. So if it doesn't get done between now and Thanksgiving, Christmas, is it possible to do it between February and November in a very kind of heated context political campaign?
You know, some trade agreements do get done in presidential election years. I think generally the belief is by the end of the year is optimum, is the zone, you know, for this to happen. Yeah, and given the work and the foundations that's been laid, I think that is the right timetable.
Time for one more question. If nobody has one, I'll come up with it. Go ahead.
You mentioned fine-tune. Could you define fine-tune? How when we have a sale agreement, how we fine-tune it?
Great question. So this will not be reopened. Mexico's already passed it. Canada's set to do that. They have an election in between. It's ready to be sent to us. But it's traditional in these agreements to reach, to sort of fine-tune, if you use that phrase, certain segments of it, both in the implementing legislation that they send, the administration will send to us, in side letters where all three countries or two will say, this is exactly how we interpret this and how we will implement it. Then there are restrictions. Once Congress passes it and it's signed, there has to be a determination to put it into force. That provides an opportunity. We've used that in Colombia with the labor action plan there and some others to, again, sort of solidify and create that reassurance. So it's pretty traditional. There are 3 or 4 avenues to be able to fine-tune an agreement with the consent of the other parties. And having 3 in that discussion is better than having 5 or 6 in a Central America type approach. And so, yeah, there are traditional ways to address those concerns. They're real.
Anyone else? I'm sorry. Bruce?
Okay, well,
We'll take both of you. Go ahead.
I would say, in what you just said, are there any issues that Mexico and Canada wouldn't agree with what's being proposed in Congress?
They are committed on labor enforcement and have created, Canada and Mexico has created a special labor working group on the enforcement to sort of share resources. They've asked for resources from the U.S. to do the same. They'll get it. On the environment, I think they are, both countries are open to how we improve environmental standards, but without reopening. Every country wants the sovereign right to decide what agreements they're in. That won't be changed ever. On the enforcement, I think my sense is both countries would be open to making sure panels can't be blocked in that state-to-state dispute.
2 out of 3 is good.
2 of the 3 is good. We're still working with the White House on this one. That's a possibility. I'm hopeful. And then on the biologics prescription drug area, that is probably I think the area where it is most difficult to really accommodate some of the Democrat concerns, because in fact what USMCA says is that there will be protections for medicines and those IP, Mexico and Canada. There is 10 years of protection before you can use the data for a new medicine, and that we think is important because it becomes close to US law, and it ensures that as we develop new medicines here, that there's an opportunity to have some burden of that cost shared by other countries as well. And so any changes there I think will be relatively minimal. And the reason I make that point is that I believe that provision is what ultimately stalled the Trans-Pacific Partnership out until, so much so, we missed the window to be able to approve it.
You're right. Bruce, last question.
This is a question that goes to USMCA, but also to the Trump administration's trade policy in general. It has to do with unintended consequences and supply chains and preemptive planning by the business and agricultural community. Is there anything in the MCA or in Congress in general to go beyond what has been offered in the past, for example, trade adjustment assistance for displaced workers, to help adjust those sectors who are hurt when China retaliates to Trump's retaliation, and they're not ready for it.
Well, beyond the assistance to agriculture that's come in 2 different tranches, there has been light discussion, but not much in that regard. I think everyone recognizes that when you change tariffs and there are retaliatory tariffs, there are impacts. As those supply chains especially, more time really eases that transition. That's not happening right now. And I think, I really believe that USMCA's passage is a confidence builder and a certainty builder in trade. Don't overlook sort of the work that's being done in Japan. They're the 3rd largest economy. They're key to the Asia-Pacific region. The 2-step of a fairly small opening that leads to a bigger one is important. And then finally, I think this does build more confidence toward an agreement with China that significantly resets our relationship for the long term. I think there's a moment in time here where President Trump and President Xi can significantly rebalance this trading relationship for the long term, which would be good for the whole interest of the world, frankly. So, look, I support the president calling China out on this. They've been cheating too long. The impacts are significant, and it's only growing. The administration is not asking China to change their economic model. They're asking them to change their economic model that relies on cheating. You know, we have a rules-based trading system. It's based on rules. There has to be confidence that those rules will be adhered to. There's an opportunity. These are difficult. These disputes are difficult, no question. There's an opportunity here to come out much stronger and a much fairer relationship for the long term.
Thank you.
Do you have time for one more?
I think we should probably end it because
Okay, why don't you come up? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor.
Very well.